Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Wednesday, 20 September. It will be slightly cloudy with highs of 14 degrees Celsius or 57 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:34 a.m. and sunset at 6:56 p.m. We are on the 51st day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I hear that the Home Army has to reorganize itself.
Yeah, you're right, Filip. The Home Army does have to reorganise itself. Tadeusz Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, he's issued an order to reorganise the insurgents into regular units of the Polish army. And it's today that he gives out this order. And I'll just read the first bit, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So, number one, the entire Home Army forces in Warsaw and the units from the Campinos Forest are now part of the Polish army as the Warsaw Home Army Corps. So they now become, instead of just a resistance unit, they are now officially part of the Polish army, and that is today. And that's really important because this will give them the rights of a normal Polish military unit, meaning they get treated as proper prisoners of war. Does this happen? No, it doesn't really, because the Germans still continue murdering and executing people in the streets, any buildings that they capture, and throughout the hospitals they're also committing murders left, right and centre. Before I get to what's happening also on the ground, I want to touch on another person. This has become my usual thing now. I've decided that I give you all a little bit more about some of the people who fought on the ground and who died on the ground on this day. So I'm going to start with Alina Wiśniewska. She was born in 1897 in an area that's currently in Belarus. In September of 1918, so towards the end of the First World War, she moves to Warsaw, where she begins to study at the Warsaw University of Technology, studying chemistry. And then in 1920, she transferred to law and political science in the University of Warsaw. Then she resigned her studies in the mid-1920s during the Polish Bolshevik War, and she decided to volunteer as a nurse in the Polish Red Cross, and she worked in one of the field hospitals, helping soldiers that had been injured from the war. She then decided to resume her studies, and then they got interrupted again, and then she just officially resigned from her studies to work in a tax office. She then got married in 1929, and her husband, Czesław Wiśniewski, was mobilised during the Second World War in 1939, and when the Soviets entered, he was taken as a prisoner of war, taken to the camp in Starobielsk, and those of you who know Polish history can guess what happened next. And those of you who don't, I'm going to tell you, he was murdered in the Katyń massacre. He was one of 22,000 men and women who were murdered as part of getting rid of the Polish intelligentsia. So a lot of these soldiers, a lot of these prisoners of war were not just part of the military, they were also part of the intelligentsia, meaning they were doctors, lawyers, teachers, people who were influential within society. So, and it wasn't just military, it was also, they pulled people out from prisons, they were also part of the intelligentsia. You've got to remember, the Soviets saw these people as a threat. The Germans did exactly the same thing with Action AB. So, and they more or less started happening at the same time. So in April, May of 1940. Coincidental? I'll blame Roger Morehouse for putting that into my head, and many years ago, so it stuck. But coming back to Michalina, in January of 1940, she joined the Union of Armed Struggle, which then becomes, on Valentine's Day 1942, officially as the Home Army, because it absorbed many other smaller organisations to become one. And then from October of 1941, she was assigned to something called a drop cell, which basically was part of receiving paratroopers, receiving cichociemni, or silent and unseen people. And what she would do, she'd bring them to where they were living, she'd visit them from time to time, help them take care of affairs, she would provide them with false documents, which is what they needed, and she helped them get used to the city, giving them maps, making sure they understood where they were. I mean, they'd all undergone this during training. Warsaw was very different from when they'd left in 1939 to when they'd arrived from 41, 42, 43. It's a completely different city. You had to behave in a completely different way, and they didn't want to look out of place. So she, as her codename, Antosha, Ciocia Antosha, she was the one who would help them. During the Warsaw Uprising, she joined the medical unit of the Warsaw District, of course, She'd worked already as a nurse back in 1920 during the Polish Bolshevik War. And then on the night of September 19th and 20th, so on this night, amongst many others, she was with one of the deputy commanders of her battalion, who was also a Cichociemny that she had helped during the occupation. They were waiting to be evacuated to the left bank of the river Vistula. And they were actually hit by a German artillery shell at that exact moment. She was torn apart. Her body was never found. But Zygmunt Milewicz he was wounded. He was then taken prisoner that same night with the group of other insurgents that had survived that shelling to Aleja Szucha, which was the Gestapo headquarters. And he managed to survive the war. They didn't execute him. He managed to survive the war. But on the other hand, Michalina, she was hit and she was killed and her body was never recovered. And I thought it would be really important to be able to talk about such an incredible woman who did so much. And I wish we'd know more about what she did during the Warsaw Uprising. And also, let's just quickly touch on what's happening on the ground. Mokotów. Mokotów is now the one being targeted, as well as Śródmieście, so the Midtown District. The Midtown District is back fighting for individual houses. They are now concentrated on two main streets in that district, and it's literally house to house, floor to floor, room to room. And again, this is going to be happening for the next couple of weeks. And Mokotów at the moment is being joined by other groups who have been evacuated through the sewers, so they're now congregating in the Mokotów district. So enough about what's happening on the ground. Roger, we're coming back to things that you were talking about yesterday. We're kind of going to continue that conversation a little bit because it kind of links in with what's happening today, and that's everything to do with the Soviets. So tell us what's happening there.
Yeah, you got the mentioned yesterday the sort of large-scale crossing of the Vistula by elements of the Berling army. We mentioned, and how the Germans were sort of feeling the heat, as it were, that they were seeing these large-scale crossings and expecting to have to abandon the western bank, at least the bank of Vistula. Well, it doesn't really pan out in that way, actually, because the German fight back obviously was extremely effective. So the majority of those that crossed the day before were killed in the battles for the western bank. So the Germans are back in control of all of the west bank of the Vistula on the 20th. And those that survived that, on the Soviet side, those that survived, tended to sort of recross the Vistula back in the other direction, which would doubtless have upset their commanders, because that's technically a retreat, and that wasn't really allowed in the Red Army. So it's kind of a significant day in that sense, because the Germans do sort of beat off that crossing of the Vistula. There's a couple of reasons for it, I think. The first one being that the Berling army was not terribly well trained. They were not really battle hardened by this point. So I think, as I've said before, they'd seen their baptism of fire at the Battle of Lenino, which was in October of 1943, and then had not really seen much in the way of action. I mean, that was a sort of propaganda exercise to a large extent anyway, and then had really not seen much action until they were thrown in at the bridgehead on the Vistula further south at Magnuszew earlier in the summer of 1944. So they were fairly green. And anyway, Soviet methods still tended to, they're much better than they had been earlier in the war, but they tended a little bit towards sort of, if you throw enough men at something, eventually you'll win. So it's a rather sort of wasteful tactic, and at least in terms of your human resources. So there's that element. They weren't particularly well trained. They weren't particularly battle hardened. And on the other side, you'll remember from yesterday, they sent this very elegantly worded and very patriotic message to the Home Army leadership in Żoliborz, in one of those districts of the west of Warsaw, looking forward to collaboration with them and saying that they wanted to collaborate in driving the Germans out and so on. Problem there, of course, is that the Home Army were intensely suspicious of the Soviets generally. I mean, as we said before, the Rising is militarily directed against the Germans, but it's politically directed against the Soviets. So there's an intense suspicion of Soviet motives in all of this, even if it's coming from, fellow Polish soldiers, but nonetheless under Soviet command. And of course, you bear in mind that, what had happened earlier on in the previous weeks in places like Vilna and Vilnius, where they initially tried to, get some collaboration going with the incoming Red Army. It's very swiftly turned to Home Army units being, arrested and disarmed and so on. So they really didn't trust the Soviets at all, even in their Polish guise. So there's that element as well. So there's, any sort of collaboration between the two on the western side was very much minimal. So consequently, as we say, the German fight back was very successful and managed to drive the remnants back across the Vistula and destroy most of those that landed in the west. Interestingly, from the one of the German accounts from the Diary of the Ninth Army, it mentions that very targeted artillery fire managed to destroy 31 of the boats that tried to cross the Vistula. So you can imagine that they're shelling the boats as they're crossing the river, which is, an extremely effective way of doing things. So you don't wait until they get to the west and then engage them. You're shelling the boats as they're crossing. And even by the German estimates, they reckon that about 800 of those that crossed were killed. So this is really, it's really a slaughter, it must be said.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for day 51. Please join us tomorrow for day 52. We are coming slowly to a close with these podcasts. We have about 2 weeks left. And thank you so much for listening.